Should we get started?
Sure.
Okay. So hello, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brone Seabright. I'm a second-year graduate student in the City and Regional Planning program at Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment within the School of Architecture. Tonight, I'm going to be representing a group of about 10 students from each of the 4 GCPE programs who've come together to form what we're kind of calling a Planning Beyond COVID-19 group. Which purpose is to help inform and connect Pratt's GCPE community with the challenges of the COVID pandemic and as it continues to change the world that we're living in. So prior to this meeting, we sent out a survey to all the interested participants to hear what they would hope to see and hear from the Pratt community in response to the pandemic, as well as for them to identify ways that they think they would like to participate in the future. A lot has happened with the Pratt community this last month. Our school has produced over 15,000 face shields using 3D printers and laser cutters. We've donated unlimited Metro cards to frontline communities, and we've started mobilizing students for the production of other personal protective equipment. But being a school of planners and designers, preservationists, and placemakers, we think that there is going to be an even greater opportunity to plan what comes beyond COVID-19, and that's why we're here tonight. So some ground rules for tonight: please keep yourself muted when you're not talking. We're going to have everyone muted by default. And if you'd like to submit questions, and we encourage you to submit questions, please use the chat function to send those in, and we'll review them as they come. So tonight we've invited 5 current Pratt professors to talk to us about the nature of intersecting crises that have happened in New York City and in other communities, and particularly how those compare to the global pandemic that we're experiencing today. So you might see spread across your screen, we have 5 panelists. They include Ron Shiffman, David Burney, Gita Nandan, Eva Hanhardt, and Juan Camilo Osorio. So the questions we will be asking the panelists come from our internal student group, as well as from the questions that were submitted through the survey that we sent out. So please feel free to take a look at that survey and fill it out while we're here tonight, if you have any ideas for future panels or events that you'd like to see happen. So please be aware that this meeting is being recorded and it may be shared publicly in the future. So to begin, I'd love to hear from each of the panelists so they could briefly introduce themselves to those of us who might not know you. If you could each let us know who you are, what your practice is composed of, both at Pratt and outside of it, and something uplifting that you've seen during the pandemic, ideally related to your own work. So in roughly 2 minutes or less, we'll like to hear from each of you. We'll go in the order that I just listed: Ron, David, Gita, Eva, and Juan, and just indicate when you are done so we can move on to the next speaker. Ron, feel free to take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for doing this, actually. I'm sure you all are aware of the fact that the faculty has also brought together a group that's looking at COVID-19 and its implications for both the pedagogy as well as the practice. I'm Ron Shiffman. I've been with Pratt, I guess since 1956, when I entered it as a student. So as I've told many people who know me, that's been a life sentence. I've worked primarily at Pratt. My outside practice is always related to continuation of work that we have started at Pratt. And that's basically to work with low and moderate income communities in and around New York City and sometimes abroad based on invitations. The purpose of the engagement is to see how we can use the academic as well as the professional resources of our department to assist community groups in making the most informed decisions they can about the problems and opportunities that lie ahead of them. And I don't know if you want me to get into the issues of the pandemic right now, but one of the things that has concerned me most over the last decade or so has been the fact that too many people have lost optimism or a sense that they can change the direction of the way things are going. The challenge of climate change is critical. It's one that I've been focusing on. And I believe that this pandemic is, if anything, a forerunner of what we will see if and when it's actually a test run for what will happen if we don't begin to mitigate and adapt to the issues that are confronting us in terms of climate change. In terms of what's optimistic, it's always been the student body at Pratt and the young people who are striving in many ways to achieve a better world. And I think that's what keeps this 81-year-old character going. And so to me, I've always been an optimist that worries a lot. And I think that's the position I think we all are in today. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. David, would you go next?
Sure. So I'm David Burney. I'm an architect by training. I actually call myself a recovering architect because I don't necessarily agree with everything that goes on in the architectural profession these days. And I've been teaching at Pratt on and off for about 10 years. For the past 5 years, I've been coordinating the Urban Placemaking and Management program at Pratt. And that's how I know many of you. Another outside activity that might interest you all is that I serve on the New York City Planning Commission. And if you don't know what that is, it's a 13-body commission that reviews land use applications from developers who do not want to comply with the standard New York City zoning resolution. And it's mostly, very large developments that require some sort of variance from the zoning. It's often the city itself doing rezonings that are often, and a lot of it's quite controversial. For example, right now before the commission is the Industry City proposal that I know some of you are involved in, and that's before the commission. So the commission meets monthly and is part of a process called ULURP, Urban Land Use Review Procedure, and it opines and comments and reviews the applications, takes in information from the community boards, holds public hearings, takes a vote, and then passes it on to the city council where the sort of ultimate decision is made. So I spend a fair bit of my time outside at Pratt working on that. In terms of what I feel has been optimistic, some of the sort of silver linings at this pandemic, and like Ron, I'm a bit of an optimist. I see a lot of them too. I mean, not just the fall in carbon emissions, but the broad realization that our level of inequality is unacceptable. But personally, the one that I'm most excited about is that we seem to be finally realizing the true value of public space. Now that we don't have it, we realize how much we miss it. And I'm hoping that after the pandemic's over and we're allowed back into the gathering again, that we'll understand the importance of it and we'll value it and we'll treat it well and program it well and maintain it well and really make social use of that asset. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. Gita, would you like to go next?
Yes, I would. If I can figure out how to unmute myself after the 1000th Zoom meeting. Hi, everyone. I'm Gita Nandan. I, shockingly, always shocks me, been teaching at Pratt for close to 15 years. And I teach a myriad of different classes, mostly focused on architecture or buildings and climate change related or energy efficiency, sustainability related topics. I am a practicing architect, although I agree with David Burney in that there is a lot wrong with the architecture profession. And I am a founder of Thread Collective, which is an architecture and urban design firm. And Elliot Malpe, who's also a professor at Pratt, is one of my partners. She's a landscape urban designer. And our practice is primarily seated at the intersection of the built environment, landscape, and creating net positive environments. I personally am mostly focused on how we can create regenerative environments, and that deals with both social, ecological, economical, sort of architectural built environment issues. So it's really looking at how we can create regenerative spaces. And I am also a co-chair of a group called Resilient Red Hook, which I'm going to move because there is lots of loud construction going on. Resilient Red Hook, which came out of a post-Superstorm Sandy Governor's Office of Storm Recovery group. And I am also board chair of a group called READY, which actually came out of Pratt. And I would consider Ron to be one of the fathers of that organization. And that is another sort of started as a community-led group and has really grown to be a much larger group and is focused on resilience education, training, and innovation. And that is another intersectional kind of project. I feel like I am often wearing many hats and sort of connecting the dots between various different professions and sectors. I believe that only success comes out of multifaceted experiences, and that's really a way to solve positively sort of a lot of the issues that we're facing. I would say positive and negative, I don't know. I mean, I am still trying to digest where we are. I feel like every day is a new level of awareness or a new insight. I am part of these groups, an emergency preparedness group in Red Hook that was started after Superstorm Sandy and kicked into high gear in the first week of COVID, when the mayor announced the stay-at-home order. And that has been incredibly rewarding, and that I'm watching this group of people that have been brought together mostly around climate change and flood protection completely pivot to be health and COVID oriented. And so, and it's a big support group, and without having the previous experience, we wouldn't be where we are now. So I can only hope that the pandemic actually leads to us understanding how we can prepare for the events that are unknown. I think that that's the most important lesson that we learn, is that we just don't know what's actually going to happen in the future. We can predict, we can try and understand, we can try and plan as much as we can, but really actually planning for the unknown is the thing that we need to be able to do in order to be flexible and, you know, sort of take on the number of various different issues that we're going to have to battle in the future. And I think that we're up to the task. It's just a question of, you know, trying to dig in and really make it happen.
Perfect, thank you. Eva, would you like to go next? Introduce yourself.
So I'm Eva Hanhardt, and I'm a planner. I have taught adjunct at Pratt over, gosh, probably more than 20 years, both in the fundamentals class and was instrumental in the redesign and of what is now the SES. And I have to say I'm incredibly impressed at the students and the faculty and the progress that Pratt as an institution has made, in particular around sustainability and the recognitions. And I want to apologize to everyone. I injured my face, but I decided that I was not going to wear a mask, at least not for the Zoom. Now,
you still look beautiful.
The other part of what I've done, I've always been working as in a professional capacity, and my most recent work has been with a women's collective, the Collective for Community Culture and the Environment, whose focus really is, its mission is to address social justice, social injustice, in other words, to remedy that, and sustainability, and in particular for low and moderate income communities, and helping them frame their futures rather than having them imposed or framed by others for them. And so the other part, professionally, I've worked for the city in a number of different capacities, both in the planning department, Department of City Planning, and the Department of Environmental Protection, which really has left me with both a focus on environmental and community-based planning. And I feel they all go very much together. The other thing, one of the other places I did work was at the Municipal Arts Society. I ran their planning center. And so much of this crisis has reminded me of some of the work we did around 9/11, another similar similarly tragic and, if you will, a sudden crisis. In fact, much more sudden in certain ways, and yet we really do not have the kind of knowledge beforehand that we really do need. Also with some work around Hurricane Sandy. In terms of what makes me feel sort of upbeat is that the curtain has been raised. The things that many of you are studying in terms of social inequalities and vulnerabilities of, in particular, of low-income communities, immigrants, and others, are suddenly now being discussed by more people. And I am hopeful that it will allow us not to go back to the failures of the past, but rather now really focus on what is possible. And I do think that there is more of a recognition in terms of more people recognizing it than had been before. Even though I'm saying something very positive, I think that it's really up to students like yourselves and others to frame that as a positive future. I do worry under our current administration in Washington that it may be framed as a very negative future. So I know I was supposed to be upbeat, but I want to be upbeat by saying that it's up to you guys and to be vigilant.
Thank you, Eva. Juan Camilo, would you go next?
Hello, everyone. I'm Juan Camilo Sorio. I'm an architect and a planner. I'm originally from Colombia, but I've been working in New York for around 15 years or so. 10 of those as an adjunct faculty member at GCPE. And I recently became a full-time faculty member. Before that, I worked initially as a senior planner and GIS analyst at the Municipal Artistic Planning Center that Eva mentioned with Eve Barron, who was the director at the time. And then I worked as director of research with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, supporting the work of that organization and analyzing the differential impacts of climate change in industrial waterfronts across the city. My work focuses on the differential and the distribution, the unequal distribution of climate change impacts in general, but specifically the political economy of climate change adaptation. And I look at that in places like New York, where the capitalist economy and the urbanization process is fully consolidated, as well as in places as remote as the Colombian Amazon, where urbanization is rather sort of a shy process embedded in the middle of the rainforest. However, the same types of inequalities are present in both. I wonder why. And so, you know, in terms of, you know, how I see what's going on right now, of course, you know, this is a tragedy. I think that what has happened, particularly in New York, is a disaster. I do concur with Ron in that, you know, this has shown what massive disruption looks like. It shows the extent of what can happen with some of the other crises that are compounding right now. In terms of the economic crisis, in terms of climate change, etc. But it also shows a little bit of the window of opportunity of what is possible. I think that beyond the type of solidarity that we've seen in the last weeks, I've also been very much impressed with actually the fact that we're beginning as a society to realize that our neighbor's health affects our health, and allowing access to everybody to have the type of resources that are necessary for having, you know, achieving well-being is not just kind of like a luxury, but it's necessary for us to survive. And that what seemed initially revolutionary, equal access to healthcare and things like this sort, are not impossible, are possible, and we can accomplish them if we want to. But the last thing that I wanted to say in terms of maybe kind of like helping us finish in an upbeat, is that I think that we're finally realizing that we have to listen to science, and that we have to listen to scientists in understanding, you know, what we need to prioritize at the moment. I think that you know, this is very interesting because there's no one better to connect theory, to connect science with practice and the built environment than, you know, designers, planners, preservationists, and placemakers. And that puts all of us at the center of this conversation. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Juan Camilo, and thank you for all of our panelists for taking the time to introduce themselves. For those of us who've just joined this meeting, we'd like to reiterate, we'd love to take your questions. Please submit them through the chat function on Zoom. And at this time, I'm gonna hand it over to Delaney for our next round of questions.
Hi, everybody. I'm Delaney Morris, a second-year placemaking student in the GCPE department, and I'll be your moderator tonight for all of the questions. So again, put your questions in the chat. I'll be giving those questions to our panelists tonight. So our first question goes to Ron, and again, to our panelists, I'll reiterate what I told you in the email. Please feel free to make this a discussion between all of you. I will be fielding one question each to each of you in this first round, and then we will go off and just let everyone answer as they wish. So Ron, how does the current COVID-19 crisis and the response differ and or share similarities with other major crises from the past?
I think I have to, in some way, describe what the major crises in the past have been, and I'll try to touch on that very quickly. In fact, I didn't really fully introduce myself before, but the founding of the Pratt Center itself grew out of a crisis that the city and cities like New York around the country and even around the world were facing. But in particular in the United States, it was sort of the confluence of a number of different phenomena that came together all at one time. One of it was the racism that we face in this country. And I must say that it was very much a major at the point in time that I graduated and was maybe even a year or two younger than you are, about 25 when I was at Pratt and studying architecture and became a student in urban planning. And then at the same time, we began to see the outmigration of more affluent families from the city, in part because much of the city was being redlined because of age, because the city was integrated or becoming integrated. We saw communities like Bedford-Stuyvesant that had not only mortgage redlining, but had insurance redlining. There were schemes at fast foreclosure. There was a whole concentration, a growing concentration of manipulation of people to sell their property at a low price to people of color, and all of that led to exacerbating the racist ties. And all of this erupted. The cities were erupting with what some called riots, others referred to them as rebellions. And there was a great deal of unrest in the cities in the mid-60s into the early 70s. And here we were sitting at Pratt, and I was asked to do a study in Bedford-Stuyvesant and started working with the residents in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And out of that interaction and the education that I received from the leadership in Bedford-Stuyvesant, as well as at Pratt, grew the seeds of what eventually became the Pratt Center for Community Development. And I'm proud to say that as a graduate student, I helped set that direction and helped organize that. The difference was that we had a president who was committed at that time to addressing issues of poverty and social injustice. And so that while we had a tremendous, and by the way, I must point out, he gets assassinated during that process. But he left a legacy. John Kennedy left a legacy of optimism, of a belief that you could bring about change. And so we were dealing with both the belief in change as well as trying to address what were substantive on the ground issues. And that led in part to to that crisis eventually being alleviated, or not alleviated, but being brought to a point where people started working on it in a concerted effort, both from the right and the left. They had different paths to take to trying to achieve the rebuilding and the stabilization of cities and the rebuilding of neighborhoods. But there was a commitment by both the right and the left to begin to address issues of racism. And we began to see some of the civil rights legislation being passed in the United States. We began to see some of the housing legislation being passed in the United States. Over the years, it evolved into the Community Reinvestment Act. First, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, then the Reinvestment Act that addressed issues of redlining and discrimination in many ways. And every step of the way, I think we contributed to that collectively as a profession and as a group of students from Pratt. In fact, some of our students were very much involved with the profession in 1968, when Whitney Young, who was the head of the Urban League at that time, which was one of the major civil rights groups. It was a sort of a moderate group, but one of the important ones. There was the Congress of Racial Equality, which moved from the left all the way to the right over the years. There was the National Association of Colored People, and there was the NAACP, and then there was the Urban League. Whitney Young spoke before the architectural profession, and his speech in 1968, which was really a groundbreaking speech, because he accused the architectural profession in both its practice as well as who were the practitioners of not really dealing with the issues of race and social justice and in this country. And at that point in time, only 8% of the architects in the United States were African Americans. 50 years later, only 8% are people of color. And so we haven't really moved along that line, although some of what he talked about changed some of the way that many of us practiced. Many of our students were at that speech, and they brought that back to Pratt, and they helped change the architectural and planning curriculum at Pratt, and in such a way that it made it much more substantive. And you today, I think, are part of the people who have inherited some of the things they fought for. The fact that we work with real people in real communities on real issues on a day-to-day basis. I don't know, I could go on for an hour or so, and I don't want to take all that time, but the difference was, I think there was a great deal of unrest that took place in the 60s and 70s. It was followed quickly by abandonment in the cities and housing abandonment. And then again, we began to look at how we could use our skills as planners and as architects to both design and package and develop communities. We developed the whole field of community-based development, which didn't exist beforehand. We allied with loads of other organizations on the ground, like the People's Development Corporation, Banana Kelly, and Adopt a Building, housing groups, the National Committee for Discrimination Against Housing, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and dozens of others. And we both informed and learned from them. And those alliances brought about the kinds of changes that today have sort of introduced a new set of problems. We no longer see the decline of neighborhoods. What we see is the overdevelopment of them that are victimizing the same people that the abandonment did in the early days. So it's too short a time to really get in and delve into all of these things, but there's always been a challenge that we faced. The challenges sometimes were localized, sometimes they were repeated and reared their heads in other urban areas around this country. This is the first time that we're facing a pandemic where every community on every level around the globe is facing it at the same time. We're also facing it at a time where the leadership in this country is the most corrupt and idiotic and stupid administration we've ever had. And I'm saying that because that should not be the norm. It's something that we need to understand, because we're not only professionals, but we also have to be people who are engaged as citizens. And we have to be very, very careful that this leadership that today called for people to protest against the governors because they were closing down and asking people to distance themselves. He asked 4 states to go out and protest against their governors. We can't accept that kind of leadership. And so our challenge has got to be, is how do we really tell the story? Tell the story that Juan was talking about. How do we get people to understand and respect science, and to respect data, and to respect information, and to respect expertise? Expertise also needs to understand that there is a broad base of expertise. We too often ignore the expertise that emanates from the communities in which we work. But we have to understand and respect that. And that's the challenge that your generation is going to have, because we can't always only talk to ourselves. And we have to make sure that we're not divided by those who benefit from our divisions any longer. I'll stop there, and I hope that we'll get into some discussion as we continue. Thank you.
Would anybody like to respond to that before I move on to the next question? We'll just move on, and then we'll get into more discussion-based questions after we go through all of you guys. So the next one is for Eva. What role do planners/planning students play in responding to the crisis? And what are the most pressing short-term and long-term needs we should be thinking of and addressing?
Okay, so in terms of the role of planners or planning students, I'll say that it is not what we've been talking about for a number of years, in particular around the environmental movements. Another world is possible. I believe at this moment, another world is necessary. And I think that it should be really the charge for planners and for planning students as to how that other world will be designed and will be implemented, because having the ideas is not necessarily enough. It also has to look, and good planning always does. You know, you may have a circle in which you have to actually implement your plans, and you have to think about how the things that you feel need to happen will be able to happen. But in terms of some of the things that planners and planning students can do, and I really recommend that in all of your coursework, you think of it in this way, and I think you will be. And that is one of the things that planners are trained to do, whether it's from placemaking to historic preservation to community, to more traditional planning, to sustainability, is to really look at things in a holistic fashion, where you will identify issues, where you will analyze them, and really help to understand how those things work together in order to create a particular scenario. So as you're doing your coursework, as you're doing your studios, bear in mind, how could this be done differently? How could this be done with the issues that have been raised through this crisis, and are not always new to the crisis, but some of them are. Some of them are more acute. And I think that that's one of the main things that you can do. And second is, as students, and to be even honest, as planners, we've got to take some risks. And I always think about Ron in this particular instance. You've got to be willing to think out of the box. You got to push that box open and be creative, because it's not as if doing things the way we've always done them, and as students learning how to do it the way that it's been done before, it really didn't work for an awful lot of things. So feel the power that you have to think about pushing that box open, and to being open about it, talk to other people about it. Talk to your friends about it. The other part that planners do, especially at Pratt, and that is to give the opportunity for others to give voice to their concerns and to hear what other people, in particular those who are most impacted by, and in different places and in different ways. In this particular crisis, there are particular impacts in certain communities that are even more acute than in other communities, but it's very important for you not to, in your creative thinking, in your creative analysis and problem solving, to think that you are the only ones who have the answer or the approach. So be open to those voices and that expertise. It comes from many diverse places, and the solutions become so much richer and the implementation becomes more possible. Now, to go to short and long term, first of all, I don't think we should separate them. And the fact is that too often in crises, whether it was hurricanes or whether it was 9/11, oftentimes we identified long-term problems, but we spent our time dealing with the short term. So in the short term, I know that Pratt has been involved. I know students have been doing masks and other things. And I think it is really critical, and it's a good time to do it, to volunteer, participate with other organizations. And when you're doing that, talk to them about both the short-term activity and the perspective that you have, looking at it from this holistic and more systemic point of view of getting other people that you're working with on volunteering for food. Part of the discussion is, why are some people needing that level of food support? Have those discussions with others and listen to what they may have to say. The other part, in terms of not making this separation between the short term and the long term. So right now, if you are, and Pratt has been very involved, I know, with producing some of the products that are needed. But let's talk about the fact that the city of New York has been pushing out manufacturing. So has this country, to be very honest. And so let's think about production, not just what you can help produce today. And that is really important, but think about, well, maybe we should have some more production capability here. And I know some people have talked about the Industry City project. I've been very involved with it, the collective was, and I know Pratt is now as well. But, you know, is consumption and entertainment really the only thing that we want to focus on? And I want to talk a little bit about a few words that I think you should think about in that long-term view, but to some degree within the short term. The first is redundancy. When you're evaluating things, make sure that you're not being so efficient, so just-in-time production, so that you're not doing just-in-time hospitals or just-in-time food. The fact is that redundancy in almost every system is an important safety measure. Because when there are crises, and there will be of a variety of sorts, if you don't have some redundancy, it really becomes a bigger issue. Two is maintenance. Why are the stockpiles that we have never maintained? Why are things that were, in fact, things that we were counting on? Because we're a country that is constantly saying that growth means doing something new and moving on and not maintaining. It also has meant not maintaining communities, not maintaining and people that live in those communities. Displacement is a reflection of not respecting the importance for people to be able to maintain their own home, places. The second is heterogeneity, or the third is heterogeneity. We, as I mentioned before with production, look at things that you are studying, plans that you are doing. Don't just follow the fad. Understand that nature understands this better than mankind does. You need to have diversity in order to have stability. And we in cities often follow what the fad of the time is. It's tech now, or it's going to be this. Well, in fact, communities need to have heterogeneity. Economies need to have heterogeneity in order to be balanced. Equity investments. Look at what you are doing and ask the questions. Who is benefiting from these things? Who is being hurt? And again, I say to you that you do this in your studies. And if many of you do have jobs, take this with you into the job. And because you're a student as well, you may be able to tell people that you're working for and with, you know, let's look at equity. I know that City Council has talked about looking implications in terms of race and equity for certain development kinds of projects, but I think it's something that you really need to do across the board. And at the same time, look at prioritizing certain issues. Look at what is being done to prioritize safety net. In other words, do not assume, and this is me, and I think that pretty much most faculty at this point would agree, trickle down has not worked. And trickle down right now will not work alone. No matter how much, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be supporting large corporations to not keep them from firing or laying off all their workers, but understand that trickle down as a process is sending support through planning, through added values to a very small percentage of people with the hope that they will eventually deal with it.
Eva, I'm going to cut you off there so that we can move on to some more questions. But this is all great.
He was just getting started, Delaney.
Huh?
He was just getting started.
No.
No, I was just going to leave it with one word, and that is to say that all of this is not just planning, it's political.
Perfect.
True, true.
Yes, we have lots of questions to get through here, so I want to make sure everybody has their time. No worries. The next one is going to go to David. David, how can cities evolve their public design and adapt public space to bridge the gap between public health and public space in a pandemic condition and beyond? Specifically, how has New York City responded spatially to the pandemic?
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, in the immediate future, the response has been the lockdown. Everybody's staying away from public space, right? Just as a way of distancing and controlling the spread of the virus. But I think, you know, it's an interesting question for planners because I think, you know, arguably, planning really started from a public health perspective. You think about the days of cholera epidemics and tuberculosis and some of the infectious diseases of the 19th century. A lot of planning grew out of that. A lot of controls on building regulations, the introduction of light and air into streets and buildings. A lot of that grew out of the concern with infectious disease. I mean, aside from the pandemic, you know, the sort of health perspective of the built environment more recently has been on chronic disease, because the biggest killer now, if you set aside the pandemic for a minute, is heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and so on, the kind of chronic diseases. And that has had a lot to do with our sedentary lifestyles, in the sense that we drive everywhere, we take escalators and elevators, we design our built environment to discourage people from moving. And exercising and moving is one of the most important countermeasures to obesity and those other related illnesses. So I think public space is enormously important because of that. Getting people out into cycling, into parks, into walking, making walkable cities is a public health program and a public health initiative as much as anything else. There has been talk about after the pandemic that we need more public space because people need to stay socially distanced. There might be more people still cycling because cycling rates have gone up. So I think that a lot of those measures are going to have to come back. We're going to need more public space more than we've needed it before. But, you know, I think it goes beyond that. I think that if you think about a post-pandemic city, you know, what does that look like? And I think it's not just about the physical public space, it's also about what goes on around that in a kind of placemaking perspective. And, you know, somebody alluded originally a few minutes ago to the food supply. And I think we've discovered a lot of the weaknesses of the kind of global supply chain, not just in food, but in other things. And I think that's something that we can change. You know, we can have much more localized food production. The Earth Institute at Columbia did a study that said that we could grow like 80% of our food within 150 miles of the city. That would make us less dependent on some of those supply chains. You know, you have to give some things up. You're not going to get strawberries in December, but that wasn't possible when I was a kid anyway. So, you know, I don't mind going back to only having strawberries in July, but we can, you know, we can do that kind of thing. And the other thing is, you know, the idea of a more community-based circular economy, where we can have a more sustainable community within a smaller area. You know, the mayor of Paris has been talking about the 15-minute city, and this started before the pandemic. The idea that you would have access to most of the things that you need, both in terms of work and culture and recreation and food within a 15-minute walk. And I think that's a really achievable and sustainable goal that we could look to after the pandemic that would work. And then beyond that, you know, issues of energy. We're sort of so interdependent on energy. We haven't had an energy crisis recently, but I remember, you know, when the power cables bringing power down from Canada go out, you know, we're plunged into darkness. So the idea of both being more self-sustaining in energy and also taking the lead on alternative energy is something that we could do much more locally. And that speaks to the issue of kind of local governance too. I mean, we've seen in this country a sort of dramatic failure of central government to actually take issue with any of the major things we have, whether it's public health or climate change or gun control. And I think we're seeing a kind of reversion to more local systems of governance, almost like a sort of city-state system. And I think that's a good thing. I think that we need to take control of our cities and our destiny more at a sort of local level. And that applies to all of those things, you know, including things like housing production. I mean, I think housing production and housing ownership could be much more local within communities. We could have more organizations like community land trusts and tenant-based trusts that keep, that retain control over things like housing within the local community. So I think all of those things that revolve around the idea of placemaking, the idea of a community built around place, is something that we can certainly look to after the pandemic. And I'm optimistic that those things can be accomplished.
Great. Ron, do you want to respond to that really quickly? I see that your hand is raised.
Yeah, I do. I think, you know, David is, I don't disagree with him, but at the same time, I think we need to be careful. While we need to have greater local production, we can't rely solely on local production. At this point in time, we lack, you know, a lot of things that we can get from abroad, but what if we are besieged by something that puts us out of the ability to produce? What if there's a drought? What if there's a flood? What if there is an earthquake or some other kind of disaster that manifests itself differently than this one? So we have to have, and I want to go back to something that Eva said, we have to have redundancy and diversity and always choices of being able to do things both regionally, internationally, as well as locally, and not be dependent only on one supply system. The other is, I remember when we relied on the federal government to set standards around the way we treat our fellow individuals, how we deal with civil rights issues. There were states that didn't didn't adhere to the human rights and didn't respect African Americans, didn't allow people to vote. So we need to develop a dual standard, you know, of having, not give up on the federal government. We have to make sure the federal government listens to expertise, listens to issues, is democratic and not autocratic, and at the same time have strong local governments. And so, you know, at one point I was anti-states' rights because states' rights perpetuated slavery. States' rights perpetuated discrimination and Jim Crow laws. It took the federal government to begin to break down those forms of segregation. On the other level, today we have a federal government that is totally dysfunctional. And, but at the same time, we don't have the ability to pay for everything we need at this point in time. The city of New York is cutting their budget by $3 billion today. There are ways I think it could raise the money, but I don't want to get into that. But we have to be careful that we don't limit ourselves. And then finally, I do believe that we're going to come back to needing open space. And sometimes, you know, I consider my house to be perfect for this event because I sit on my stoop and I see my neighbors, but I'm always 6 to 8 feet away. So maybe we need to have design that allows us to come together and hug each other, but also to separate at various different points in time. So we need to be more creative on all of these things. David's points, as usual, are articulate and right on.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't disagree, Ron, with the issue of flexibility. You're right. I was thinking more of the fact that, you know, now we're having to make our own masks at Navy Yard because we can't rely totally on the supply chain. So having that kind of backup and that kind of redundancy is important. Yeah.
I wanted to make a quick comment on both David and Ron's points, to maybe add that two things. One, that I very much agree in that this is a moment where, you know, thinking progressively really means rethinking the role of government, where central government can be progressive as long as it's committed to plan equitably. A moment in time where we need to plan central infrastructure as much as distributed resources to make progress. And that central infrastructure or central planning and central infrastructure projects have to be equitable and have to be sustainable and can do so. But at the same time, it's a time to invest in the social infrastructure. And this is a term that Geeta has been, you know, bringing up in our discussions. I hope, Geeta, that you come back to that at some point, where the solidarity economy has provided an entire lexicon of strategies, like, for example, worker-owned cooperatives, to get to what Ron is talking about. And then finally, I wanted to say that I don't think that capitalism is the problem here. I think that we can take over the institutions of capitalism, like markets, like incentives, and make them work for people, not profits. The problem is a neoliberal ideology, but it's not capitalism. The capitalism is not good or bad, but we have to take over and make sure that it works for people in an equitable way.
Yeah, it's how the capitalism is structured itself. I mean, if you look at Germany and France, you know, often those capitalistic markets are working for the people, you know, and there are still profits to be made for the higher ups, but very few people are starving.
We can just get into your question next. It kind of lends itself to what Ron was initially bringing up with disasters, actually. And so we are in the midst of this global pandemic, of course, not the only issue that is happening in the world right now, i.e. climate emergencies. How can we combat these other disasters and crises and divert resources to help in that situation while still combating the challenges of the pandemic?
So I don't know where to even start, but like, I think that the word diversion is the wrong word to use. So I was writing about this for something else unrelated to Pratt, but I realized, and I'm sure most of the people that are on the panel, all of our colleagues at Pratt, are in the same boat, but I realize I have been in New York City through 9/11, Superstorm Sandy, the economic downturn, and now this. And so it's sort of like, oh, wow, I've sort of lived through 4 disasters, or I will have lived through 4 disasters in New York City. And I think what we have to become aware of is that if we are sort of in tune with what's happening around the globe, that the word disaster or emergency is becoming fairly common, right? If you start to think about the fires in Australia and the fires in California and the heat waves across the globe in various different decades, that these are they are known to be disasters because they feel sort of unique, but at the same time they're not unique, right? And so I think that the word diversion is maybe the wrong word, because I think we always have to be prepared to be working on multiple fronts at the same time. And so to me, the issues of climate change, which is something that I'm focused on, like we can't lose perspective. We can't pretend like it's not happening. We can't pretend like this summer we will not be inundated by tornadoes and floods and sea level rise and potential crazy heat wave. In 2003, there was a heat wave across Europe that killed 70,000 people within 2 months. I mean, that's tragic, right? I mean, we were very worried about our mother-in-law at the entire time. It's like 15,000 people died in France in 2 weeks. So there is tragedy that befalls the globe at the same scale of what COVID-19 is befalling. So I think we have to acknowledge, it just as this is a global issue, whereas most of those disasters are localized. And so therefore it's harder to sympathize with those issues, whether it's the fires in California or the storms that hit Madagascar last year. But, we're looking at 20 to 30 million people per year that end up becoming both migrants and losing their home and falling out of sort of in situations where climate change is a disaster for them. So while I want to say like, oh, we don't want to divert money. We want to be able to really take into consideration these issues that are going to start happening more and more often on a much more regular basis. And how do we adapt to them so that way we can be sort of secure in terms of food and heat and, and they're just much larger systemic issues that are at play in the role of all of that. So, I think that the issue around COVID-19 for me has just been like, there's been a really big lens put on what it is, the systems that we have that we appreciate. Like we all have, I am actually in a space that has no heat and no hot water. And it's a very interesting experience to go through COVID-19, right? And I'm only here intermittently and my husband is here all the time. And so, and and so then you can begin to have a lens on what it's like to be in a place across the globe that has no heat and no hot water, right? And that's pretty intense. So when we're looking at one pandemic and then we're overlaying in other factors, there was an article written recently that was about heat and what would be to happen if we were doing this through June, July, or August. That's really intense. If anybody was here in the summer last year in July of 2019, we were looking at temperatures that were close to 102, 104 degrees sustained for over several days, right? And so once again, then you're dependent on energy. My neighbors in Red Hook had a blackout in Red Hook a couple days ago. So there were several people who had no access to Wi-Fi or electricity. And that is another layer of, once again, energy independence, where, I'm obsessed with equity along all these issues, but beyond the equity issues within the construction and utilization of these systems is then just the issues around access to them, right? And so when we're looking at multiple sort of overlapping issues, it becomes that becomes incredibly worrisome. And I do think that the pandemic is beginning to nicely highlight the localized issue, like David Burney so wonderfully stated to me, like the localization. I hope that people become more in tune with their local neighborhood and their local community and local access. And right now, I do feel like there has been a blowing up, I don't know how to say it, a global, not obsession, but like everybody wants to travel the world and everybody wants to get the best butter available in New York City, which is in downtown New York, Manhattan, or like, to me, there's this brings about like just the desire to have like, sort of the basics, right? And the basics we can, sorry, my cat, the basics we can get, and we can actually be pretty satisfied with the basics. And I think in order to solve some of climate, so the one thing that's benefiting from COVID-19 is the earth. And we all just have to acknowledge that right now, is that this is the biggest breather that the earth has ever had. And may not be good for our economy or our workforce or our pocketbooks or anything else, but the air is clean. My relatives in Delhi can literally see across the street right now. So, being able to have clean air, cleaner water, cleaner, less pollution. It's the lowest amount of airplanes that have ever flown in the entire history of, the modern world. Like, so these are good things, but then the real question begins to be like, well, when we all quote unquote go back to the new normal, what does that mean? Do we just all begin to like start flying excessively around the world? I mean, the amount of flights that I know that quote unquote sustainability consultants have taken, I know somebody who was going to take 16 flights in 2 months, and she's a sustainability consultant. And I'm like, maybe we should be rethinking this, right? So there's a law, like to me, there's an irony in some of the work that we're doing. And I think we need to begin radically reassessing that. And as like cool and hip as it might sound to fly to 16 different places and have personal interactions, it's detrimental to our planet. And so I think that what this is allowing us to say is like, hey, maybe I can still be reconnected across the world, but actually do it virtually. Like maybe we can begin to occupy some of the same spaces we had, but do it in a way that's much less harmful to the overall sort of, sort of climate planet that needs that I think we've lost perspective in a lot of ways. And that's
the trick, isn't it, Gita? How do we see that cat?
How do we? I know.
Your only heat source, right?
Yeah, my cat is like really obsessed with like hanging out right now.
A little alternative energy there, right?
Yeah.
I had a quick comment. I don't know, David, if we're going to say something about.
I was just going to say that's the trick. That's the question. How do we not snap back to the old ways?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I want people to really think about the beauty of where we are now. I know everybody is so stressed, and it's stressful for me too. Like in a health perspective, I'm in a health condition. My husband's in a health condition. We don't want to get sick, but like at the same time, like there's some beauty in it. I have not eaten out or done takeout in 40 days or 40 nights. And I'm not obsessively like about eating out, but that's a beautiful low waste situation, right? And so like that's one lesson learned, like no flying, bicycling, very few cars on the road, being able to actually check in with your neighbors because your neighbors are your first point of contact. Like, I hope that, I don't know what the answer is to like capture that and then emphasize it, but I want to figure that out because to me, there are so many beautiful lessons to be learned as long as we don't get over bogged down with the negative part of it.
I think that's the issue, is how do we really learn and continue to teach the lessons that we're learning out of this, because there are injustices and inequities that are being amplified at the moment, and we just can't continue to accept them. I remember when I was a kid, polio was a major issue. And when I was 8 years old, we couldn't go to beaches. We were not allowed to go to beaches.
And we may not be able to go to beaches this summer. I mean, we do not know that yet.
And we had to space ourselves out. And eventually a vaccine came, and it solved that issue. This epidemic, it may be a year, it may even be longer, there will be a vaccine. There are no vaccines for climate change. There are no quick fixes for climate change. And so we really have to understand that what we learn here has to be applied in much more dramatic ways in the future. And I think it's really important that we understand that our engagement is not momentarily, it has to be ongoing.
I'd like to
I wanted to build on actually what Ron, Geeta, and Eva said in this regard, because I very much agree that there's a window of opportunity right now, and that window is about to start. I don't think it has started yet, and it will close very quickly. But I think that as much as we have to imagine and dream and be ambitious in terms of the type of transformations that are possible, we have to be also humble, and we have to learn how to listen. And we have to recognize the type of innovation that Eva was talking about, because it comes from the ground up. And I think that, that kind of like reminds us of the concept of frontline communities, and the fact that those that are impacted directly by some of these issues, as Geeta was saying, are actually the ones who know better what the type of solutions and what the type of innovation actually could look like. And I think that is important in the sense of kind of like addressing what Ron was talking about in terms of, where is the long lasting impact of the type of actions that we can take right now. And I think it is in solidifying and strengthening our community partners that can then take this on. I think that, part of what I'll be talking about in terms of the Sandy Regional Assembly has to do with the fact that moment in time allowed for a little bit of a window for some of the community partners that we work with in the environmental justice movement to begin sort of seeding initial ideas that then turn into massive campaigns that led to the People's Climate March and affecting the Paris Agreement, that led to UPROS right now being a national and international climate justice leader, that led to NIJA leading with others, NY Renews, and the process to design and begin implementing the Community Protection and the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, arguably one of the most aggressive climate change mitigation plans in the world. But it is in that partnership and strengthening and learning how to take a back seat, as Elizabeth Yampier says, and really allowing the community partners to lead that process, what really guarantees that longer term impact.
Perfect. Juan Camilo, let me just really reiterate the question that I'm going to ask you for everybody before you get into it more, but it is during Sandy recovery, you served on the Sandy Regional Assembly. How important is it to act locally, regionally, and nationally right now as we begin the healing and recovery process from the current crisis? And again, this discussion is really great, but just go on for everybody else to know this question.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, I think that, a lot of people right now say that cities are positioned as leaders in climate change. But I think that, one of the things that I really want to kind of like strengthen is that it's not enough to stop at the city level. And that means both really re-engaging with regional and national government in meaningful ways, but also going supra-local and really making sure that the grassroots are represented and have the space to lead. Before Hurricane Irene, before Superstorm Sandy, NIJA had documented, the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, where I was working at the moment as director of research, had documented that out of the total 5.5 million people of color in New York, half of them lived in census tracts that were vulnerable to potential hurricane storm surge. The city hadn't really even started researching the type of potential impacts in working industrial waterfronts. And NIJA was able to show that approximately 430,000 of them both lived in areas that were vulnerable to storm surge, but also half a mile away from massive chemical concentrations that could potentially expose. And, you know, Sandy hits, and not everyone is affected in the same way. Surprise, surprise. But there was a window of opportunity after Superstorm Sandy that the environmental justice movement, I think, very effectively was able to take advantage of. And that window, in a way, happens when city government, and I think that this is about to happen right now, stabilizes the situation. And as soon as the curve begins to flatten, the city is going to begin thinking about recovery. And in the very first phase of this, they will reach out to everybody to gauge how people are thinking about this and consolidate feedback. And then that will close and the government will go back to its normal functions. So at the moment when Sandy had hit, a lot of the community environmental justice groups were in their neighborhoods and remained in their neighborhoods for November, December, and only came out in mid-January to something that was called the Sandy Regional Assembly. And we're talking about around 200 participants. Several of folks that are in this room were there facilitating and volunteering in that meeting. We're talking about 40 organizations from New York City, New Jersey, and Long Island that had been impacted by Sandy and wanted to come out to share what they have learned and to begin planning ahead. And that was a really interesting moment because it offered these groups the opportunity to begin thinking about what were the opportunities to work together and position them as experts. Because at that point, the city didn't know, the state didn't know, and the federal government didn't know what was exactly happening in these communities. And so this was a pivotal moment where that group published this report. Well, you can see it. It's underwater, no pun intended. But you can kind of like see it. It's a really, really cool document. I encourage you to see it. That combined two things, both a research agenda with goals, objectives, and recommendations for things that had to be researched at the moment, like, for example, to actually quantify the public health impacts of the storm, which, by the way, was never really fully done, but also a series of shovel-ready projects. A list of interventions that a lot of these groups had been planning for decades, but had always been ignored, that were ready to be used. And I'm talking about greenways and green infrastructure and their co-benefits. I'm talking about emergency preparedness centers building on solidarity, not just walls and supplies, microgrids and redundancy, but also renewable resources in environmental justice areas. You can look it up. These groups had been planning for these with a real sort of long-term innovative vision, but had been largely ignored. What changed here was that they were able to consolidate these ideas, bring them back, quantify them, and submit this to the city before the city had its own recovery plan. And they were able to submit this to the state before the state its recovery plan. And then it was able to submit this to HUD. And we presented this over there before HUD had its plan ready, and we're able to get some of them in there and then leverage resources to insert leadership from the movement in a decision-making level. And I'm gonna end by saying that, you know, how can we expect that a pandemic is not gonna show, you know, disproportionate impacts? Climate change, natural disasters, and pandemics really kind of like mirror the level, or their impact mirrors the level of social and environmental inequality in this society that they hit. And I think that this moment in time is no different. If you look at the statistics, it's really interesting to see and to hear somebody like Eddie Bautista, director of the environmental justice movement, kind of like summarize what the preliminary research is showing. You know, we've been reading that a slight increase in particulate matter 2.5 can lead up to 15% increase in death rates for COVID-19. Think about what that means for communities like South Williamsburg, the South Bronx, places that have the highest rates of asthma in the country. He also summarized information coming from ANHD in terms of how much African Americans are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, not just in New York, but across the country. In New York, African Americans are being tested positive at a 28%, and they're only 22% of the population. Latinos are being testing positive at 34%, and they're only 29% of the population. The Bronx has the highest concentration of population of color, has the highest rates of pre-existing conditions, and right now it's having the highest rates of positive cases and deaths from COVID-19, which makes them much vulnerable to any other compounding crisis. I think that you heard from some of the other panelists that, you know, we're about to hit the summer. The heat is about to arrive, and what's going to happen once heat waves begin to you know, hit New York, and social distancing is going to be impossible for folks that don't have an AC and that have to go outside. But then two other final indicators that I want to make sure I highlight. Eddie Bautista also highlight two really interesting things. One, the 5 zip codes with the highest rates of COVID testing have an average per capita income of $26,000 per year, which is under poverty. Yet the 5 zip codes with the lowest average of rates of COVID have an average per capita income of over $118,000. So, you know, the statistics are speaking for themselves. What we need to make sure as professionals,
and the testing.
Professionals, designers, planners, preservationists, and placemakers. And I really want to make sure that I really list them all, because we are a community, an interdisciplinary community that can work together on this. But I think that we really need to make sure that we coalesce with those forces on the ground that know really what is really happening, that knows exactly what is needed, and that now more than ever need our support to be able to raise their voices and move and catapult their ideas, their visions forward. And that doesn't mean that we necessarily cannot push those boundaries forward, that we can suggest ways to alter and strengthen their arguments. But I think that we need to really learn how to listen and how to be humble, because as Eva said, you know, that is the leadership that we need to cultivate right now and support.
Thank you. Oh, Eva, do you want to respond?
Well, I obviously agree with what Juan Camilo was saying. And I think that I want to go back to what Juan Camilo was saying, but also a little bit of what Guido and others have been saying. And that is, I think there is a tremendous lesson to be learned from this experience and how we approach climate change, because we have been denying science or putting science off as a society. We have not been listening to the voices of environmental justice in a systemic way. We have thought about it, well, maybe in this community or in this particular way, but rather than looking at the broader issues of systemic vulnerabilities and the fact that the same communities will be affected through every crisis in a disproportionate way, and we cannot assume that that will change. I think that the whole concept, though, around climate change and sustainability and resilience are things that many people have been thinking about and do have alternatives. What now has to happen is that we need to take this crisis as a lesson learned. And so we don't repeat the putting off, the, well, it would be nice, but we can't change people's minds too quickly. Those are people we can, as Gita well said, oh, that's something that's limited to one community. In many ways, that's been what's been done in New York City in environmental justice communities. We will put those things that are polluting and not put in regulations because, well, they're sacrifice zones, you know, for the greater public good. We have to understand that some places will be impacted more. Well, I do think that this can be a lesson on listening to science, listening to those people that are affected, and moving forward. And I think it's a real great, I hate to use the word opportunity. I don't like using it. I think it's a responsibility.
Can I
agree fully with Eva. We have to do that. But I woke up this morning and the first thing I read was a piece in the Times about the fact that people are now blaming Bill Gates, who wrote a piece a number of years ago, I think it was 2015, about a pandemic. And they're now saying he created the pandemic. He's responsible for creating it. It's been tweeted 1,000 of times, and it was retweeted by the President of the United States. So you've got Laura Ingraham and that whole Fox network out there feeding misinformation. He's replaced Soros as the villain of the right now. They claim that he's there to try to make money on the vaccine that will be eventually developed, or hopefully eventually developed. And when you've got stories like this, we have to begin to think about how do we send out the messages so we begin to talk to people beyond our own circles.
Right, and I want to
terrific difficulty. And I'd like to learn from others.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on Ron, in only that I'm having like the tale of two cities kind of experience right now, and that I'm in Brooklyn on occasion in Red Hook to have heat and hot water and shower and work a little bit. And then I come up to this other place in upstate New York, which is Newburgh, New York, which I have to say, we as a collective need to acknowledge that our experience of the pandemic in New York City is pretty radically different than other parts of the country. And so I do want us to also acknowledge that as you move outside the city, you will not be having the same discussion or the same reaction or the same belief system as you have in New York City. So when I come up here, and we have a lot of contacts and friends, and we are now the dirty New Yorkers that shouldn't be anywhere outside the city. And it's kind of, I mean, everybody still loves us, but it is very interesting. And at the same time, there's a lot of disbelief that COVID exists. There has been a lack of understanding of self-isolation. There has been very little mask wearing. It's actually just now that the mask wearing that's been mandated as a statewide rule and regulation, that it's actually happening. And so I do want us as a collective to really understand that we also need to look at how other people or other parts of the world are reacting and dealing with this. It's not the same as our New York City experience. It's actually pretty radically different. And I have to say, Newburgh is a very low income Black community. And it has had a disproportionate impact. We have the highest rate of COVID here in the entire county, and then in parts of in many counties that are surrounding us. And so there's it's a real health issue, and at the same time, it relates to education. It relates to the fact that all of the food centers have closed. We are literally feeding a few homeless people that we know because the food location, the pantries have been closed. So they're like, while the COVID impacts some things, it also impacts like this whole chain that then brings, you know, people who are living on the edge. It just is, it's compounding. And I'm sort of at a loss at how to deal with some of this stuff because it feels overwhelming, right? But I just want to acknowledge that there are other places in the world that are very different than what New York City is experiencing right now.
Thank you.
To build on that. Can I build on that really quick?
I just need to really quickly, because some of the panelists need to hop off right at 7:30. I want to honor your time and thank you. But we will be extending this until 8 p.m. if you want to stick around. We're going to do that. Juan Camilo, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I'll take a minute. No, not even. Two quick things. And I also woke up to Stephen King, asking for forgiveness to haven't written everything that he's written. So, going back to Ron's point.
Did you hear his interview about being inside a Stephen King?
Yes. I wanted to go back to kind of like what Eva said a minute ago, and when I said at the beginning, we both, I think, and Ron, I think as well, placed a lot of emphasis on listening to science, but I think it's important to also maybe like define that a little bit and say that it's not limited to Western scientific knowledge production, but it also has to recognize other different ways of knowing what we know. And I think that this is important, building on what Gita was saying, and maybe like bringing it back to New York for a minute, because we don't know really what are going to be the longer term impacts of what's happening here. At this point, we really don't know whether we can actually become immune. We'll see. But I'm also very interested in understanding the physical, but also mental health implications of the moment that we're going through. And I think that we're going to have to rely, and we should rely on kind of like the knowledge and the experience of the folks that have been experiencing this on the ground, and especially in the neighborhoods where this has been the most critical. And I'm talking about Corona, for example, where I think John Hopkins reports today that overall we're above 13,000 deaths or something like that. But that number is grossly undercounting everybody died at home. Everybody that, couldn't reach a hospital because, they were scared of being deported, or they couldn't afford it, or they were dealing with eviction and who knows what else. And I think that's really important because Ron has really been making sure that we understand that when we're talking about this moment, we're not just talking about the health implications, which this is a tragedy. Nothing else to say on that. It's not only about the economy, which is crashing, but this is also about democracy. And I really hope that Ron can close us off a little bit with some of his thinking on this. Because in Corona, the same folks that are being undercounted are terrified with the idea that if they miss the census this time, they're going to run into the same situation that made Elmhurst Hospital so understaffed, so under-resourced. The last time around, people didn't fill out the census. New York lost population in that congressional district, leading to losing congressional support, losing federal resources, and losing delegates in the electoral colleges. So this is as much about public health and as much about the economy as it is about democracy. And Ron, I really hope that you can kind of like circle us back to some of your thinking in that regard.
Juan Camilo, just before you turn it over to Ron, one of the things I did want to say, and Ron, I hope I'm not jumping into something you would be saying, and that is that for many of you as students, vote, get your friends to vote. We even saw that under the Sanders campaign, the youth vote was not as large as others had hoped. And that's not to say it's all about just this particular administration. There's more to it. But that is one thing that you can do, among others, is vote, register people to vote, in addition to the census, obviously. The other thing that I did want to just say very quickly is that thinking of Gita talking about, it's experienced differently if you're rich or poor. I'd like to think that I'm not rich, but I happen to have a place outside of New York that I have gone to. Now, the fact is that those are differences, not just geographic differences, but there are also economic differences in how one experiences this particular or any other crisis like climate change, where people have the ability to move out of the danger in that way. So,
not to mention the global disparities between
exactly.
the industrialized world and the developing world.
You know, David is absolutely right. And what's going to occur because of this is, you know, I said earlier that the inequities and injustices of our society are exaggerated during a disaster. What's going to happen as a result of this disaster and the economic fallout is that the economic disparities that exist in our own city and in our country are going to get dramatically worse. They're going to get dramatically worse. 2/3 of those unemployed in the New York area earn under $40,000. 195,000 of them are undocumented and don't even qualify for any form of assistance. I mean, this is really untenable. When you deal with those disparities, it's going to translate into their housing conditions. Who are the folks that are dying? They're people in nursing homes and in places where they're living in overcrowded conditions. And we really need to begin to address the housing issue in such a way that we not only have redundancy, but we have adequacy, because we don't have an adequate housing supply. And as we discussed last night, and I think Juan put it very clearly to our students last night, we really have to begin to think about how many people live in a particular apartment. How many people are forced to live in a bedroom? How many people live in are now living in hallways and in their own apartments, and you have people doubled and tripled up. So we really have to begin to look at the housing issue, and we have to solve it on a local level, because we're not going to get the national support for that. And how do we develop those resources when the mayor, I think, stupidly cuts back on our capital budget? David had a piece the other day. Why are they cutting back on what the city's infrastructure improvements are and in the architectural work for housing, when all of that comes out of bonding money, which doesn't come out of the expense budget? At a point in time, we can raise that money at 0 interest rates. So we really need to get back into that local dialogue. So we need democracy on a local level. We need democracy not only in terms of people who can vote and can be counted, those are absolute necessities, but also engagement on an everyday level and beginning to be aware of all these issues and raise them in every venue that you can. But we also can't abandon the regional issues or the national issues, because if we can solve the problem of COVID-19 in New York and they don't solve it in Pennsylvania, it's going to come back with vengeance back into New York, and it will recycle right back the first time somebody moves, because this virus knows no borders. Pollution knows no borders. We need to work on regional levels as well. So we have to deal with that. We have to work on the national level. And here I'm really worried. I am sure that in a popular election, Trump would lose by more than 10 million votes, more than he lost last time, significantly more. But I'm not sure he will not lose the electoral election. And I'm not sure, because the kind of manipulation that went on to stop voters in Wisconsin and is going on in Pennsylvania and in other places around the country may take root. The nice thing about Wisconsin is they lost, and they lost big. And so we have to make sure that we communicate not only with your friends that and neighbors in New York City, but many of you are not now in New York. You're in New Jersey, where Delaney is. Others, I have no idea where you are. There are 36 people still left on this panel. But you have to talk to your friends who are in Texas, who are in Ohio, and really get everybody you know to tree out and get people to be concerned about voting, concerned about answering the census, and most of all, concerned about realizing, as I think Juan has eloquently put it today, listening to the people on the ground. You know, to my mind, we are very good as planners of describing what goes on in a neighborhood. We can even reach the point of explaining it. We don't really understand. And it's until we really engage with the experts on the local level that you really begin to get an understanding. And it's the understanding that leads to people's ability to address intractable and wicked problems. And what we need to do is use our resources as designers and planners and placemakers and all of the allied professions, use those processes to solve those problems, because we all have that ability. So I'll stop there. But most of all, we can't forget the role that we play as citizens.
Thank you, everybody. Really quickly, because I see that people are starting to hop off here, even though we're going to keep it open until 8. I just want to do a quick housekeeping thank you to all of our panelists right now. This was excellent. We're going to ask one more question right after this, but I also want to shout out and say thank you to Brown for organizing this with Juan Camilo, and thank you to the rest of the GCPE student committee who has been putting this together. We have been chatting while this discussion is happening via text, and we think that this should continue to be a series. So please look out for more of these conversations, because obviously there are so many questions that we have not gotten to at this point, and we would like to address them. But for now, we're going to leave it with one more question that we have decided on as a group that we got from the chat. And it is a combination of questions from Claudia and Rebecca. And this can go to anyone here. And it is, can someone discuss the idea of social distancing and how that will impact our cities physically and psychologically, both with how we interact with space and with others? And how can this drive the craving for public spaces and people's social interactions when this crisis is over?
Well, let David go, because I was going to steal his thunder. Go ahead.
Oh, no, not at all.
No, you go.
It's a good question, and I think it's a question we don't really yet know the answer to. I do think that there's a craving for public space and for the interaction in public space, and I have the same experience that Ron described earlier of sitting on the stoop and talking to my neighbors, and it actually in ways that we haven't done since the last block party, you know. So I do think that craving will return and people will want to be back into public space. But there's always going to be the fear of, you know, what happens next time. And I think I was having a conversation today about this in terms of buildings. You know, is it going to change the way we use office space, for example? But do we need to be ready to have more flexible space so that if we do need to social distance in the future, we can? Do we need to, is it going to change the way we work? Is the sort of remote working going to become more the norm than not? So there are lots of ways that I think are still to be played out in how this affects people. You know, psychologically, I mean, I'm not really qualified to answer that, but I don't think that's going to be a permanent change. I think people's innate sort of atavistic desire for social contact is not going to go away. I think it's going to come back. I think we're going to appreciate that social contact more. I think we're going to be value our public space more and value our public interaction more. So I think that's probably a good thing.
I would echo what David just said. I think, you know, I can only react for myself. I yearn to be able to hug people. And my grandkids came to visit. They were 10 feet away from me today, down at the bottom of the steps. I was on at the top. And so, but you know, we could do that. You know, I'm privileged. I'm living in a neighborhood. I have a house. I have a stoop. I have rooms that I could carry this laptop to all around the house. And I have, you know, I'm not going crazy by being trapped in one little environment, and I don't have the ability to put go to Cuba the way David has, to call Scotty and all of a sudden he's in Cuba. But I do think people have this enormous need to be together. When I did a week ago walk up to Prospect Park on a Saturday when the sun was out, people were there. They were distancing themselves, but they were there and they were inching towards each other. I remember after 9/11, as the people were walking up Flatbush Avenue in droves, escaping from Lower Manhattan, everybody went to the parks. I remember being there with, at that time, my 8-month-old grandson and seeing the ashes fall in the park, but the playground was filled. Whenever there's a disaster, our need is to get together.
You know, it's funny you talk about Prospect Park. I'm there in the morning with my dogs, and the people are all more than 6 feet apart, but the dogs are all running about among themselves. You know, it's kind of funny.
Well, maybe the dogs should walk us.
Yeah, really.
I actually have
that part of us will. I don't think we're going to lose the need for public space. I think we're going to need to get flexibility, and we're going to need to deal with what are really the inequities in public space. The fact there aren't enough parks, the fact that there isn't enough rooms and housing to allow people to live together, that people have to live in shelters because the number of people dying in shelters are similar to those in nursing homes. And so we have to make sure that we provide housing. And that's something we're going to have to fight for on a local level, because I don't think we're going to be able to get a national government, at least for 2 or 3 years, that's going to do it.
I was going to say just very quickly, I totally concur with what both Ron and David said, but I think we need to be a little careful whenever there is a crisis like this. We assume that the next one's going to be exactly the same. And so with Sandy, we now assume that anything else will have the same kind of inundation as we had with Sandy, that it won't have higher winds or other things. So, you know, I would be careful to assume that every next crisis will require social isolation. And in fact, public spaces probably become the few spaces where people can be 6 feet apart in very dense cities. So I myself don't think that we're going to see social isolation making people unwilling to be in public spaces in the long run. It will be for a short while, I'm sure, until hopefully we have something to address this particular virus, this particular pandemic. But again, I would just say that we need to be vigilant beforehand and prepare as things happen. Part of the reason it's as severe, the social distancing, as it is now, is because we put it off and we didn't address those issues up front.
But I don't want us to lose the sight that the disparities that exist must not be forgotten, and we have to address those. Otherwise, they're going to get bigger and bigger, and then the disruptions that are going to take place will be of a completely different nature, but they'll be earned because of our inaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to, before answering the question, I wanted to acknowledge, I think Rebecca, who posted in the chat that she was from another school, which I think it's fantastic. And I think that that's something that we should be cultivating here, which is cross-pollination with our colleagues in other schools. In the faculty, we're trying to do that with the new school, but it's great that there's folks from other schools here, and we should start reaching out to them and understanding how they're thinking about it and how can we collaborate. I think that that's kudos to the students on that. I want to offer maybe like a couple additional perspectives on this. I think that this has shown now more than ever that there's going to be an increased reliance on the internet for everything. I think that this has changed how we shop. It has changed how we work. And I don't think that we're going to go back necessarily from that. I think that things are going to change dramatically in that sense, which has already been said. But I want to talk about maybe some ideas on how that's going to actually affect us in terms of the underlying inequalities, as Ron was saying. I think it's really hard right now for some of you, I'm sure. The dean wrote about this. Our dean in the School of Architecture wrote about this this week. Ron shared that article and has been highlighting it to all of us, describing the type of inequalities that this has highlighted, even within our community. It's really hard to find a space, as you were hearing before, where you can have a quiet kind of like hour and a half, 3 hours to focus and engage in a meeting. In some cases, it's really hard to have the bandwidth necessary to be able to fully communicate and engage with video and audio, and not be sort of struggling to make sure that people can hear you or see you. But I think that, so I think that it's going to be, you know, we're seeing the immediate impacts of that. But I'm worried about the fact that as people begin to work more and more from home, there may be a worst case scenario where public debates around funding for public infrastructure, like public transport, and general subsidies for some of the other types of services and infrastructures that, you know, are involved when we walk out to work and when we shop and when we live our lives outside, could actually be reduced and cut down. As people, those who have access to online life, may not require or need them as most. And those who cannot afford this will have to continue to rely on these infrastructures, just as it's happening with solar and renewables. Those who have access to the capital to install them in their rooftops are benefiting from the gain, but those who are not are now being impacted by higher utility costs. And I want to talk about another thing in this regard, which is maybe like a positive impact of the way in which this online transition will affect our lives. Another thing that the dean mentioned in her article, which is that now more than ever, there's going to have to be additional experimentation in terms of both improving our lives and improving our productivity, but checking in terms of principles and privileges. And I think that there's a really interesting question there, which is to what extent as a society are we going to be able to prioritize well-being over performance, right? Making sure that at a time like this, we're taking care of ourselves and not necessarily prioritizing everything that needs to be done and to do that perfectly, but that we rather invest in that well-being, in that public health, so that we can increase our productivity and maintain that balance. And I'll stop with that.
Thank you, everybody. I think we're going to end it right there. I would like to again thank all of our panelists, thank Brown, the student planning team, Pratt GCPE, the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment, and Pratt Institute as a whole. I'd like to thank all of you for coming and staying tuned in to our conversation. We will be finding a way to post this video online so that you can reference it later on. We will also be looking into creating a larger series for this event. Please make sure, if you want to stay in tune with all of this, please fill out the survey that is posted in the chat by one of our committee members, Braley. And everybody, please stay safe out there, and we will see you next time, hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks, Delaney. Well done. Great meeting.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.